Chapter 7. Civilization as an Ideological Concept. The demand for a more exact definition. There is no agreement today as to the meaning of the concept civilization in intellectual and scientific circles, as, by the way, is the case with other fundamental terms. This springs from the fundamental meaning of our epoch, shifting from modernity to post-modernity, which essentially affects semantic fields and linguistic forms, and inasmuch as we find ourselves in the stage of an unfinished transition, an inconceivable confusion reigns in our ideas. Someone uses customary terms in their old sense. Someone feels the necessity for semantic displacement and glances into the future, which has not yet come. Someone fantasizes, perhaps coming closer to the future, or simply falling into individualistic, irrelevant hallucinations. Someone else gets completely confused. Whatever the case might be, for the correct use of terms, especially key terms, to which, undoubtedly, the concept of civilization belongs, it is necessary today to carry out, let it be elementary, a deconstruction tracing the meaning to its historical context and retracing its basic semantic shifts. Civilization as a phase of the development of societies. The term civilization received wide circulation in the epoch of the rapid development of the theory of progress. This theory proceeded from two fundamental, paradigmatic axioms of modernity: the progressive and unidirectional character of the human development, from minus to plus, and the universality of man as a phenomenon. In this context, civilization, for L.H. Morgan, defines the stage in which humanity, in the 19th century, everyone uncritically believed as one in the evident existence of such a concept as humanity, commences after the stage of barbarity, while that, in turn, replaces with itself the stage of savagery. Marxists adopted such an interpretation of civilization easily, having written it into the theory of the evolution of economic systems. According to Morgan, Taylor, and Ingalls, savagery characterizes tribes engaged in gathering and primitive kinds of hunting. Barbarity relates to non-literate societies, occupied with the simplest kinds of rural economy and cattle breeding, without a clear division of labor or development of socio-political institutions. Civilization signifies by itself the stage of the appearance of letters, socio-political institutions, cities, crafts, technological improvements, the division of society into classes, and the appearance of the developed theological and religious systems. Civilizations were thought as historically steady and able to be preserved, developing, but with their primary features remaining constant over the course of millennia, such as the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Roman civilizations. Civilization and empire. However, together with the purely historical phase meaning in the concept of civilization, a territorial sense was also included, though less explicitly. Civilization offered a vast enough area of diffusion, that is, in addition to a considerable temporal dimension, a broad spatial diffusion was also presumed to characterize it. In this territorial sense, the borders of the term civilization in part coincided with the meaning of the word empire, in the sense of a world power. Empire, in this civilizational sense, pointed not to the peculiarity of a political and administrative arrangement, but to the fact of an active and intense spread of influence, proceeding from the centers of civilization to the surrounding territory, supposedly populated by barbarians or savages. In other words, in the very concept of civilization, one can already espy the character of expansion and the export of influence characteristic of empires. Civilization and the universal type. Civilization worked out a new universal type, qualitatively differing from the models of barbarian and savage societies. This type was most often built on the globalization of that ethno-tribal and or religious center that stood at the source of a given civilization. But in the course of this globalization, that is, through the equating of the concrete ethnic, socio-political, and religious patterns to the universal standard, The very important process of transcending the ethnos itself occurred, transferring its natural and organic, most often unconsciously imparted, tradition into the rank of a man-made and conscious, rational system. The citizens of Rome, even in the first stages of the empire, already differed essentially from the typical residents of Latium, while a variety of Muslims, praying in Arabic, went far beyond the Bedouin tribes of Arabia and their direct ethnic descendants. In this way, at the time of the move to civilization, social anthropology qualitatively changed. Man, turning to civilization, had a collective identity imprinted on a fixed body of spiritual culture, which he was obliged to assimilate to a certain degree. Civilization assumed a rational and volitional force from the side of man, that which in the 17th century, after Descartes, philosophers started to call the subject. But the necessity of such a force and the presence of a model, abstracted and fixed in the culture, equalized itself, to a certain extent, with both the representatives of the core ethnos of religion lying at the foundation of civilization, and those who ended up in the zone of influence from other ethnic contexts. To adopt the foundations of civilization was qualitatively easier than to be accepted into a tribe, inasmuch as there was for this no demand to organically absorb the gigantic reservoirs of unconscious archetypes, but to perform a series of rational, logical operations. Civilization and culture. In some contexts, depending on the century or the author, in the 19th century, the concept of civilization was identified with the concept of culture. In other cases, hierarchical relationships were established between them. Most often, culture was thought of as the spiritual filling of civilization, while civilization properly meant the formal structure of society, answering to the main points of the definition. Oswald Spengler, in his famous book, The Decline of the West, even contrasted civilization and culture, considering the second an expression of the organic, vital spirit of man, but the first a product of the cooling off of that spirit in mechanical and purely technical boundaries. According to Spengler, civilization is a product of cultural death. However, such a sharp-witted observation, correctly interpreting some qualities of contemporary Western civilization, did not receive general acknowledgement. And most often, today, the terms civilization and culture are used as synonyms, although each researcher can have his own opinion on this point. Post-Modernism and the synchronistic understanding of civilization. Even the most cursory survey of the meaning of the term civilization shows that, in using it, we are dealing with a concept saturated with the spirit of the Enlightenment, progressivism, and historicism, which was characteristic for the epoch of modernity in its uncritical stage, that is, until the fundamental reconsideration of the 20th century. Faith in the progressive development of history, in the universality of the human path according to a common logic of development from savagery to civilization, was the distinguishing feature of the 19th century. But already with Nietzsche and Freud, the so-called philosophers of suspicion, this optimistic axiom started to be doubted. And over a period of the 20th century, Heidegger, the existentialist, traditionalist, structuralist, and the last postmodernist smashed it to bits. In postmodernity, criticism of historical optimism, universalism, and historicism acquired a systematic character and established the doctrinal premises for a total revision of the conceptual apparatus of Western European philosophy. This revision itself has not yet been carried out to its conclusion, but what has been done by Strauss, Barthes, Ricoeur, Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, and others is already enough to convince one of the impossibility of using the dictionary of modernity without a thorough and rigorous deconstruction. Paul Ricoeur, summarizing the thesis of the philosophers of suspicion, paints the following picture. Man and man's society consists in rational conscious components. Charisma, according to Bultmann, superstructure, according to Marx, ego, according to Freud, and the unconscious, properly, structures in the structuralist understanding, bases, the will to power of Nietzsche, the unconscious, And although externally it seems that the path of man leads directly from the captivity of the unconscious to the kingdom of reason, and that this exactly represents progress and the content of history. In fact, under the closest scrutiny, it becomes clear that the unconscious quote-unquote myth proves much stronger and, as before, considerably predetermines the work of the intellect. Moreover, reason itself and conscious, logical activity is almost always nothing other than a gigantic work of repressing unconscious impulses. In other words, an expression of complexes, strategies of displacement, the substitution of projection, and so on. In Marx, the unconscious is played by the quote, forces of production and industrial relations. Consequently, civilization does not merely remove savagery and barbarism, entirely overcoming them, but itself is built precisely on savage and barbaric grounds, which transfer to the sphere of the unconscious, but there is not only nowhere to escape from this, but, on the contrary, they acquire unlimited power over man, to a large extent precisely because they are thought to be overcome, and even non-existent. This explains the striking difference between the historical practices of nations and societies, full of warfare, oppression, cruelty, and wild outbursts of terror, abounding in aggravating psychological disorders, and the pretensions of reason to a harmonious, peaceful, and enlightened existence under the shadow of progress and development. In this respect, the modern era is not only not an exception, but also the peak of the intensification of this discrepancy between the pretensions of reason and the bloody reality of world wars, ethnic cleansing, and the historically unprecedented mass genocides of entire races and narodai. And in terms of savagery, modernity possesses the most perfect technical means invented by civilization, right up to weapons of mass destruction. Thus, the critical tradition, structuralism, and the philosophy of post-modernity force one to move from the mainly diachronic, phased interpretation of civilization, which was the norm for the 19th century and which, by inertia, continues to be widely in use, to the synchronic. The synchronic approach assumes that civilization comes not instead of savagery or barbarity, not after them, but together with them and continues to coexist with them. One can imagine civilization as the numerator, and savagery/barbarism as the denominator of a conditional fraction. Civilization affects consciousness, but the unconscious, through the unceasing work of dreams, Freud, constantly misinterprets everything in its favor. Savagery is that which explains civilization and is the key to it. It turns out that man hurried to proclaim civilization as that which already actually happened, while it remains not more than an incomplete plan, constantly suffering disruption under the onslaught of the cunning energies of the unconscious, however we might understand it, as Nietzschean will to power, or psychoanalytically. The deconstruction of civilization. How, in practice, can one apply the structuralist approach for the deconstruction of the concept of civilization? In compliance with the general logic of this operation, one should subject to doubt the irreversibility and novelty of that which constitutes the basic characteristics of civilization, in contrast with savagery and barbarity. The main characteristic of civilization is often thought to be an inclusive universality, that is, the theoretical openness of the civilizational code for those who would like to join it from without. Inclusive universality is, at first glance, the complete antithesis of exclusive particularity, the primary characteristic of tribal and ancestral societies of the pre-civilizational period. But the historical pretensions of civilization to universality, ecumenicalism, and, correspondingly, uniqueness, constantly pushed against the fact that, besides the barbarian nations, beyond the borders of such a civilization, there existed other civilizations, with their own unique and different variants of universalism. In this case, a logical contradiction was placed before civilization. Either one must admit that the pretension to universality proves groundless, or one must include the other civilizations in the category of barbarians. While recognizing this groundlessness, various decisions can also follow, either to try to find a syncretic model of the unification of both civilizations, at least in theory, into a general system, or to admit the correctness of the other civilization. As a rule, in confronting such a problem, civilization acts on the basis of an exclusive, not inclusive principle, and considers the other civilization defective, that is, barbaric, heretical, or particular. In other words, we are dealing with the transfer of the previously tribal ethnocentrism to a higher level of generalization. Inclusivity and universalism, in practice, turn into a familiar exclusivity and particularism that is usually attributed to savagery. This is easy to recognize in the following striking examples. The Greeks, considering themselves as a civilization, numbered everyone else among the barbarians. The origin of the word barbarian is the onomatopoeic pejorative, signifying him whose speech makes no sense and is a bundle of animal sounds. Many tribes have a similar relationship to members of a different tribe. Not understanding their language, they think the others have no language at all. Consequently, they do not consider them people. From here, incidentally, is derived the Slavic tribal name Nepsi. Germans, that is, Nemi, meaning dumb, silent, or mute. For those who do not know what anyone calling himself a man should know, the Russian language. Among the ancient Persians, who represented precisely a civilization with pretensions to the universality in the form of their Mazdean religion, this was expressed even more clearly. Division into Iran, which was people, and Turan, which was demons, was drawn on the level of religion, cults, rites, and ethics. The matter came to the point of the absolutizing of endogenous relations and the normalization of incest, in order that the solar sun of the Iranians, Ahura Mazda, would not be profaned by the impurities of the sons of Angra Mainya. Judaism is a world religion, having pretensions to universalism and having laid the theological foundations of monotheism, both for Christianity and for Islam, which were developed by a few civilizations simultaneously, is, to this day, almost ethnically limited to the blood tribes of the Halakha. The tribal system is based on initiation, in the course of which the neophyte is informed about the foundations of the tribal mythology. On the civilizational level, this same function is played by religious institutions, and in comparatively later epochs, by the system of common education made deliberately ideological. Neophytes learn the myths of modernity in other conditions and under another veneer, but their functional value remains constant, while their foundation, if one takes into account the Freudian analysis of the substitution-repression actions of reason and the, quote, ego, has not strayed far from legend and tradition. In a word, even a rough deconstruction of civilization shows that the claims to overcoming previous phases are illusions, while in practice, big and developed collectives of people united in a civilization, in essence, simply repeat, on a different level, the archetypes of the behavior and moral systems of, quote, savages. Hence, endless and even bloodier wars, double standards in international politics, fits of passion to private life, and the constantly broken ethical and normative codes of moderate and rational societies. Developing Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, Rousseau, by the way, sharply criticized civilization as a phenomenon and thought of it as the source of all evil, one can say that the civilized man is none other than the wicked savage, a defective and perverted barbarian. The synchronic and plural understanding of civilization prevails today. With these preliminary observations, we can at last turn to that which we include today in the concept of civilization, when we developed Huntington's thesis about the clash of civilizations, or raise objections to it with the ex-president of Iran, Khatami, insisting upon a dialogue of civilizations. The very fact that there is hardly any consensus in the use of the term civilization evidently shows that the phased, purely historical and progressive interpretation of that concept, prevailing in the modern epoch and generally accepted in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, has clearly lost its relevance today. Only the most outdated researchers, who are stuck in the uncritical modernity of Kant or Bentham, can contrast civilization and barbarity today. Although it is comfortable to use the term civilization instrumentally in a historical analysis in the description of ancient types of societies, still, it clearly lost its ideological charge as a global positive in comparison with a global negative, barbarism and savagery. Universalism, gradualness of development, the anthropological unity of human history, on the philosophical level, all of this has long been put into question by his studies in structural anthropology based on the richest ethnography and mythological material of the life of North and South American tribes. Levi Strauss convincingly showed that the conceptual and mythological systems of those same, quote, primitive societies, by their complexity, richness of nuance, connection, and functional elaborations of differentiations, are in no way inferior to those of more civilized countries. In political discourse, there is still talk of the privileges of civilization, but even this already looks anachronistic. We confronted such a spike of uncritical ignorance when liberal reformers tried to present the history of Russia as a continuous chain of unchecked barbarity in the face of flourishing, resplendent, and established Western civilization. However, even this was not only an extrapolation of the bravado-based propagandistic extensions of the West itself and a result of the network of influences induction, but also a form of Russian cargo cults, the first McDonald's, private banks, and clips of rock bands shown on Soviet television were perceived as sacral objects. With the exception of these propagandistic symbols or the hopeless backwardness of uncritical philosophers, in the framework of an even distant familiarity with contemporary philosophy, still the concept of civilization, in discourse that does not contradict the mainstream, is interpreted without any moral charge whatsoever, but is used as a technical term, and implies not something opposed to barbarism and savagery, but to another civilization. In Huntington's famous and aforementioned article, there is not a word about barbarism. He speaks exclusively of the borders, structures, peculiarities, frictions, and differences of various civilizations which are opposed to each other. And this feature is one of not only those of his positions or lines of argument stemming from Toynbee, whom Huntington clearly follows. The use of this term in the contemporary context already suggests a blatant pluralism, comparativism, and, if you like, synchronism. Here, philosophical criticism and the reconsideration of modernity, implemented in 1,000 different ways in the course of the whole 20th century, are immediately impactful. And so, if we dismiss the occurrences of uncritical liberalism and the narrow-minded naivety of pro-American and pro-Western propaganda, we will see that today the term civilization in operational and active political analysis is used above all synchronically and functionally in order to designate wide and stable geographical and cultural zones united by approximately common spiritual, moral, stylistic, and psychological arrangements and historical experience. Civilization in the context of the 21st century signifies precisely this: a zone of the steady and rooted influence of a definite social-cultural style, most often, though not necessarily, coinciding with the borders of the diffusion of the world religions, and the political formation of separate segments entering into a civilization can be rather different. Civilizations, as a rule, are broader than one government, and can consist of some or even many countries. Moreover, the borders of some civilizations cross countries, dividing them in parts. If, in antiquity, civilizations most often coincided with empires and were, in one way or another, politically united, then today their borders correspond to invisible lines, irrelevantly superimposed onto the administrative borders of governments. Some of these governments were never a part of a single empire. For instance, Islam spread almost everywhere in the conquests of the Arabs who built the world caliphate. Others did not share a common statehood, but were united among themselves in different ways, religiously, culturally, or racially. The crisis of the classical models of historical analysis: classical, economic, liberal, racial. We have established that, in the use of the term civilization in the 20th century and in the framework of criticisms of modernity, there occurred a qualitative shift to the side of synchronicity and plurality. But can one take a step further and attempt to understand why, in fact, this word usage became so topical in precisely our time? Indeed, the earlier concept of civilization was not a subject of deliberate problematization, while it was customary only for humanitarian and academic circles to think in terms of such a category. Other approaches, economic, national, racial, class-based, dominated in political and closely related to it political science discourse. Today, we see that to think only in terms of economics, to speak of national governments and national interests, and more so, to put class analysis or the racial approach at the head of one's analysis, is less and less acceptable. And on the contrary, it is rare that some statement or speech of a political actor passes by without a mention of the word civilization, to say nothing of analytic texts, where this term is perhaps most prevalent. With Huntington, in fact, we see the attempt to make civilization the central moment of political, historical, and strategic analysis. We are clearly on our way to thinking in terms of civilizations. Here we should look more attentively at that which, precisely in the main versions of political science discourse, substitutes itself for civilization. To speak seriously of races is not acceptable after the tragic history of European fascism. Class-based analysis in the mainstream became irrelevant after the fall of socialism and the breakup of the USSR. And at the moment, it seemed that the sole paradigm of political science would be liberalism. Meanwhile, the impression grew that the national borders of homogeneous, essentially liberal democratic governments, no longer confronting any kind of systematic alternatives laying claim to a planetary scope after the fall of Marxism, would soon be abolished, and a world leadership and a one-world government would be established with a homogeneous market economy, parliamentary democracy, world parliament, a liberal system of values, and a common infrastructure of information technology. In 1990, Francis Fukuyama emerged as the herald of such a wonderful new world in his policy book, The End of History and the Last Man. Fukuyama brought the development of the phased interpretation of the concept of civilization to its logical conclusion. The end of history, in his version, signified the final defeat of civilization over barbarism in all its forms, guises, and variants. Huntington argued with Fukuyama, advancing as his main argument the fact that the end of the opposition of the clearly defined ideologies of modernity, Marxism and liberalism, in no way signified the automatic integration of humanity into a unified liberal utopia, inasmuch as under the formal constructions of national governments and ideological camps were found deep tectonic plates, as it were, continents of collective unconsciousness, which, as soon became clear, were by no means overcome by modernization, colonization, ideologization, and enlightenment, and, as before, predetermined the most important aspects of life, including politics, economics, and geopolitics, in one or another segment of human society according to their belonging to a civilization. In other words, Huntington proposed to introduce the concept civilization as a fundamental ideological concept and called for the replacement not only of the class-based analysis, but also of the liberal utopia, which took too earnestly and uncritically the propagandistic demagoguery of the Cold War, and thus became, in its turn, its victim. Capitalism, the market, liberalism, and democracy seem universal and commonly human only externally. Each civilization reinterprets its substance in accordance with its own unconscious templates, where religion, culture, language, and psychology play a massive and often decisive role. In this context, civilization acquires a central significance in the analysis of political science, stepping into first place and replacing with itself the clichés of the liberal vulgates. The unfolding of events in the 1990s shows that Huntington proved in this argument to be closer to the truth, and Fukuyama himself is obliged in part to reconsider his views, having admitted that he evidently spoke too soon. But this very revision by Fukuyama of the thesis of the end of history demands a more thorough reconsideration. The step back of the liberal utopians, state building. The problem is that Fukuyama, analyzing the discrepancy of his predictions about the end of history through the prism of the global victory of liberalism, still tried to stay in the framework of that logic from which he had first proceeded. Consequently, he needed to implement a one-time reality check and to turn aside from that in order to admit the correctness of his opponent Huntington, who, in his forecast, proved by all signs closer to the truth. Then Fukuyama made the following conceptual move. He proposed to defer the end of history to an indefinite date, and meanwhile, to engage in the strengthening of those socio-political structures that were the nucleus of the liberal ideology in its previous stages. Fukuyama advanced a new thesis, state building, as an intermediate stage for the transition to global government and world leadership. He recommended strengthening national governments with a liberal economy and democratic system of rule, in order to more fundamentally and profoundly work the soil for the final victory of world liberalism and globalization. This is not a rejection of the perspective. This is its postponement until the indefinite future with a concrete proposition concerning the intermediate stage. Fukuyama says almost nothing about the concept of civilization, but clearly takes into account Huntington's thesis, indirectly responding to him. The steady development of national governments, which proved cramped both in the epoch of colonization, in the epoch of national liberation movements, and in the epoch of the ideological opposition of the two camps, must now proceed in due course. It is this which will lead gradually in different societies adopting the market, democracy and human rights, uprooting the remains of the unconscious and preparing a more fail-safe than now soil for globalization. Thomas Barnett's The World as Network. In American political science and foreign policy analysis, there also exists a new promulgation of a purely global theory, presented this time in the essays of Thomas Barnett. The meaning of this conception comes down to this: that technological development establishes a zonal division of all territories on Earth into three regions: the core, the zone of connectedness, and the zone of disconnectedness. Barnett thinks that network processes freely penetrate through borders, governments, and civilizations, and structure the strategic space of the world in their own way. The USA and European Union are the core. There are concentrated all the codes of the new technologies and the decision-making centers. The majority of other countries, doomed to a user relationship to the network, constitute the, quote, zone of connectedness. They are compelled to use ready-made technological means and to adjust to the rules that are worked out by the core. To the zone of disconnectedness belong the countries and political forces that have stood up in direct opposition to the US, the West, and globalization. For Thomas Barnett, as for Daniel Bell, technology is fate. In it is embodied the quintessence of civilization, understood purely technologically, almost as with Spengler, but with a positive sign. The American view of the world system, three versions. In American political analysis, and we must recognize that it is precisely the Americans who set the tone in this region, all three conceptions of the separation of subjects on the map of the world coexist. Globalization and civilization, in a singular sense, in the spirit of Fukuyama's earlier ideas, are reflected in Barnett's constructions. Here, only the core is recognized as a subject. The rest is subject to external direction, that is, to de-subjectivization and de-sovereignization. Fukuyama himself, critically examining his earlier, optimistic statements, takes an intermediate position, insisting that one must, for some time longer, recognize national governments as a subject, the development of which must prepare a more secure ground for the coming globalism. And finally, Huntington and the supporters of his approach think that civilizations are excessively grand and foundational realities, which can well lay claim to the status of being the global subjects of world politics. When the previous ideological models collapsed, national governments started to lose, in leaps and bounds, the real stuff of sovereignty under the influence of the separate, effective aspects of globalization, but globalization itself, while breaking old borders, was and is unable to actually penetrate into the depths of societies with settled traditional components. It is significant that those forces in the world which strive to slip away from globalization, westernization, and American hegemony in order to preserve and strengthen anew their traditional identity hold to precisely Huntington's thesis. Only in place of the gloomy, catastrophic discourse of Huntington concerning collision and conflict, they started talking about dialogue. But this almost propagandistic, moralistic nuance should not lead us into a misunderstanding concerning the most important task of those who largely accept Huntington's model. In the first place, this is the Iranian President Khatami's juxtapositioning of collision or dialogue. The question is secondary and practical. Much more important is the principled agreement that precisely civilization becomes today the foundational, conceptual, analytic subject of international politics. In other words, in contrast to both globalist maximalists like Barnett and to moderate liberal statists, the supporters of civilizational method explicitly or implicitly take their stand on the position of a structuralist, philosophical approach to the understanding of world processes. The marking out of civilization as the foundational subject, pole, and actor of contemporary world politics is the most promising ideological approach, both for those who want to objectively evaluate the real state of affairs in world politics, for those who are striving to select an adequate toolkit for political science's generalizations of the new epoch, the epoch of post-modernity, and for those who are striving to defend their own unique identity in the conditions of a progressive blending and also of the real attacks of network globalization. In other words, the appeal to civilizations allows one to organically fill the ideological vacuum that was formed after the historical crisis of all theories that had opposed liberalism, and also after the internal crisis of liberalism itself, which was unable to handle the guardianship of the contemporary world space, as the unfortunate experience of Fukuyama's utopia confirms. Civilization as a concept construed in the contemporary philosophical context proves to be the center of a new ideology. This ideology can be described as multipolarity. The scantness of the ideological arsenal of opponents of globalism and the unipolar world. Opposition to globalism, which announces itself even more loudly on all levels and in all corners of the planet, has not yet formed into a concrete system of views. In this is the weakness of the anti-globalist movement. It is unsystematic and deprived of ideological orderliness. Patchy and chaotic elements prevail in it, most often representing an inarticulate mixture of anarchism, irrelevant leftism, ecology, and even more extravagant and marginal ideas. In it, third-rate losers of Western gauchism lay claim to the leading roles. In other cases, globalization collides with resistance from the side of national governments, which do not wish to give over part of their sovereign authority to external control. And finally, the representatives of traditional religion, as well as supporters of ethnic and religious independence, actively resist globalization and its Atlantic Western liberal democratic code, its networked nature, and its value system, individualism, hedonism, laxity. We see this especially clearly in the Islamic world. These three existing levels of opposition to globalization and American hegemony are unable to lead to the development of a general strategy and distinct ideology. which would be able to unite different and disconnected forces, at times incompatible in scale and oriented in contrary ways in relation to local problems. The anti-globalist movement suffers from the, quote, disease of infantile leftism and is blocked by the experience of a whole series of defeats suffered by the global leftist movement in the last century. National governments, as a rule, do not have enough of a scope to throw down a challenge to the highly developed technological might of the West. Besides, their political and especially economic elites are completely involved in transnational projects dependent on that very West, while local ethnic and religious movements and communities, although they can, at certain moments, prove to be an ineffective opposition to globalization, are too uncoordinated to count on in earnest for a change in the foundational trends of the world, or even for a correction of course. The meaning of the concept civilization in opposition to globalization. In such a situation, the concept of civilization comes to help as a fundamental category for the organization of a full-blown alternative project on a world scale. If one puts this concept at the center of attention, then one can find a basis for a harmonic resonance of alignment of broad governmental, public, social, and political forces into a general system. One can unite under the banner of a multiplicity of civilizations, peoples, and religious and ethnic communities living under various governments, offering them a common, centralized idea in the framework of a concrete civilization, and leaving them many choices for the hunt for identity inside it, allowing for the coexistence of civilizations, differing according to their fundamental parameters. And such a perspective absolutely does not necessarily lead to a clash of civilizations, Huntington notwithstanding. Here, both conflicts and alliances are possible. The most important thing is that a multipolar world emerging in such an instance will create the real preconditions for the continuation of the political history of mankind, inasmuch as it will normatively affirm a variety of socio-political, religious, moral, economic, and cultural systems. Otherwise, simple and sporadic opposition to globalism on a local level or on behalf of an ideologically amorphous mass of anti-globalists will only postpone this end, and will put the brakes on its onset, but will not become a real alternative. Toward large spaces. The selection of civilization as the subject of world politics in the 21st century will allow one to conduct regional globalization, a unification between themselves of countries and narodi relating to one and the same civilization. This will allow one to make use of the benefit of social openness, not in relation to everyone simultaneously, but rather in the first place to those who belong to a common civilizational type. An example of such integration along civilizational criteria is afforded by the new supranational political organization of the European Union. It is a prototype of regional globalization, including in its boundaries those countries and cultures that have a common culture, history, and value system. But, having admitted the undoubted right of Europeans to form a new political subject on the basis of their own civilizational differences, it is rather natural to admit an analogical process in the Islamic, Chinese, Eurasian, Latin American, and the African civilizations. After Carl Schmitt, it is customary in political science to call analogical projects of integration large spaces. In economics, even before Schmitt, this was theoretically understood and employed in practice with colossal success by the creator of the model of the German customs union, Friedrich von List. The large space is a different name for that, which we understand by civilization in its geopolitical, spatial, and cultural senses. The large space differs from other existing national governments precisely in that it is built on the foundation of a common value system and historical kinship. It also unifies a few or even a multitude of different governments, tied together by a community of fate. In various large spaces, the integrating factor can vary. Somewhere it will be religion, somewhere ethnic origin, somewhere cultural form, somewhere the socio-political type, somewhere geographic position. An important precedent, the creation of a European Union, shows that the embodiment of the large space, in practice, the transition from a government to a supra-governmental establishment built on the foundation of civilizational commonality, is possible, constructive, and despite all internal problems, positively unfolds in reality. A register of civilizations. In contrast to national governments, it is possible to argue about the number and borders between civilizations. Huntington separates out the following: 1. Western, 2. Confucian, 3. Japanese, 4. Islamic, 5. Indian, 6. Slavic Orthodox, 7. Latin American, and possibly 8. African civilizations. However, some considerations force themselves on us. Huntington includes the USA and Canada in Western civilization with Europe. Historically, this is accurate, but today, from a geopolitical point of view, they constitute in relation to one another two different large spaces, the strategic, economic, and even geopolitical interests of which diverge ever more and more. Europe has two identities: the Atlantic, for which it is entirely fair to identify Europe and North America, and the continental, which on the contrary is strongly attracted to the construction of independent policies and to the return of Europe to history as an independent player, and not as a mere military beachhead for its North American younger brother. Euro-Atlanticism has its headquarters in England and the countries of Eastern Europe, which are moved by an inertial Russophobia, while Euro-Continentalism has its in France and Germany, with the support of Spain and Italy. This is classic old Europe. The civilization is, in any case, one, Western, but its large spaces, it may be, will be organized somewhat differently. By Slavic Orthodox civilization, it is more accurate to understand Eurasian civilization, to which belong historically, organically, and culturally not only the Slavs and not only the Orthodox, but also other ethnicities, including the Turks, Caucasians, Siberians, and so on, and a significant portion of the population professing Islam. The Islamic world itself, undoubtedly united religiously with the constantly growing awareness of its own identity, in its turn is separated into a few large spaces: the Arab world, the zone of continental Islam, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the diffusion of Islam in the Pacific region. A special place in this picture is occupied by the Muslims of Africa, but also by the constantly growing communities of Europe and America, and, nevertheless, Islam is precisely a civilization, more and more recognizing its peculiarity and its differences from other civilizations, and, in the first place, from liberal Western civilization, which has been actively treading upon the Islamic world in the course of globalization. It is complicated to establish borders between the zones of influence of Japanese and Chinese civilization in the Pacific region, whose civilizational identity remains open to a significant degree. And, of course, it is difficult for now to speak of a common consciousness of the inhabitants of the African continent, although in the future this situation might change, inasmuch as in the present process there is at any rate historical precedent, such as in the African Union, but also in the existence of a Pan-African idea. The growing intimacy between the countries of Latin America in recent years is evident, especially considering the fact of North American pressure, although it is too early for now to speak of process of integration. There are no existing barriers at all to the integration of the Eurasian expanse around Russia, inasmuch as these zones were politically, culturally, economically, socially, and psychologically united during the course of many centuries. The western border of the Eurasianist civilization goes somewhat more east of the western border of the Ukraine, making that newly formulated government a fortiori fragile and not viable. Essentially, the enumeration of civilizations gives us an idea of the quantity of poles in a multipolar world. All of them, besides the West, dwell, so far, in a potential condition, but at the same time, each of these civilizations has serious, impressive grounds to move towards integration and to become a full-fledged subject of the history of the 21st century. The multipolar ideal. The idea of a multipolar world, where the poles will be as many as there are civilizations, allows one to propose to humanity a broad choice of cultural, paradigmatic, social, and spiritual alternatives. We shall have a model with the availability of regional universalism in concrete large spaces, which will give to enormous zones and significant segments of humanity an unavoidable social dynamic, characteristic of globalization and openness, but without those shortcomings that globalization has taken on a global scale. Moreover, in such a system, regionalism and autonomous and independent development of local, ethnic, and religious communities can be developed at full speed, inasmuch as the more unifying pressure, characteristic of national governments, weakens considerably. We see this in the European Union, where integration considerably facilitates the development of local communes and so-called Euro regions. In addition, we shall be able at last to decide the fundamental contradiction between exclusivism and inclusivism of the imperial identity. The planet will present itself not as one, sole oikumene, with the inherent cultural racism of this solitariness in the distribution of the titles of civilized nations, as opposed to barbarians and savages, but as a few oikumenes, a few heavens, where there will live side by side, in their rhythm, in their context, in their own time, with their own consciousness and unconsciousness, not one humanity, but a few. It is impossible to say beforehand how relations between them will turn out. Surely, both dialogue and collisions will emerge. But something else is more important. History will continue, and we will return from that fundamental historical dead end to which uncritical faith in progress, rationality, and the gradual development of humanity drove us. Something in man changes with time, but something remains eternal and invariable. Civilization allows one to strictly develop everything in its place. Reason and the philosophical, social, political, and economic systems created by it will be able to develop according to their own lines, while the collective unconscious will freely preserve its archetypes, its basis, and inviolability. Moreover, in every civilization, both rationality and the unconscious can affirm their own standards, secure their correctness, and strengthen them or change them according to its own discretion. There will be no universal standard, neither in the material nor in the spiritual aspect. Each civilization will at last receive the right to freely proclaim that which is, according to its wishes, the measure of things. Somewhere that will be man, somewhere religion, somewhere ethics, and somewhere else materialism. But in order that the project of multipolarity can realize itself, we must still survive more than a few skirmishes. And, in the first place, it is necessary to get the better of the first and foremost enemy, globalization, the striving of the Atlantic Western pull to hang its unipolar hegemony on all the nations and countries on Earth. Despite the deep and sure observations of its own best intellectuals, many representatives of the political establishment of the USA continue as before to use the term civilization in a singular sense, understanding by it American civilization. This is the real challenge, to which all nations of the earth, and Russians most of all, must give an adequate response.